Have you ever thought about making grand paintings, like the ones you'd see in the loading screen of Dota or the cover art of your favorite games/media? As a painter of various mediums myself, I've always wanted to make something awesome and grand, big paintings of something epic, scenic, or breathtaking. And nowadays, I'm able to make things that are decent or presentable. However, nowhere near as close as the paintings I've been inspired by. But, hey, I'm getting there. But today, I'd like to share my experience and the knowledge I learned in trying to make epic paintings. By epic, I mean grandiose, wide aspect ratio, mythical paintings. In my youth, I played a ton of video games, but one game that had great impactful art was Dota. Now, I wasn't good with the game. Many of my junior high school classmates in the net cafe can vouch for that. But every time the loading screen would boot up, there was that epic splash art of these mythological figures that just captured the intensity, the atmosphere, and the epicness of the world that game was set in, which was basically a mod for Warcraft 3 Frozen Throne. In senior high school, I was obsessed with the Elder Scrolls, particularly Morrowind, the world, the landscape, Michael Kirkbride's art, and vision. The Red Mountain in specific enamored me to the point where it became a yearly ritual for me from there on to paint a giant landscape of it every year or so. And by college, I got into Warhammer, the Imperial Knights in specific. Just the idea, sight, and awe I would feel when these semi-slow, janky, and ornamented mechanical suits strode across the battlefield. In particular, the art of one Igor Sid and his cover for Renegade Knights just captured that awesome feeling. But for a time, my art and how I dealt with it got in the way of making anything presentable. Many of my early epic paintings were just flat, inexperienced, and empty. Even when I got better at rendering and portraits in my digital art, the first take I did with making epic paintings was the wedding of Nerevar and Almalexia from Morrowind. And as you can see, as much as I put detail and form to as many things as possible, the composition and layout just felt flat and left this gaping empty space in the middle. Long ago, I had a vision of an epic giant tree on a cliff, and the first time I made it, it didn't look so great. Rather, I painted what I thought looked like a tree, what I thought looked like a cliff, and what I thought looked like the sky and sea and distant mountains. I did this over and over again for many years until the fateful day I quit digital art for a while. Even in 2021, where I was getting my digital art back on track, when making big grandiose paintings like, as I mentioned beforehand, the wedding gift painting, I also tried to go back and make my treehouse painting, which, while it did have better rendering, the composition and feeling of epicness and awe was still lacking or absent. It was literally the same thing, only rendered better, which doesn't improve it that much. As much as I learned how to render and compose individual figures, to make something big, I had to think big. And so this is where my watercolor experience helped me in bettering my digital art to make epic paintings. Because with watercolor, when I did landscape art, I was always forced to think big and not mind the minuscule details such as the jewelry or creases of clothing when making portraits. But the large chunks of the sea, the walls of the building, or the towering mountains, I had to prepare, compose, and deliberately plan my paintings, which is quite a logical thing to do. But when it came to digital, I was more reckless and loose, less disciplined, at least at that time. And so that was it. And my first order of business was to repaint the botched treehouse painting I made for my comic, which was the epic tree that I had envisioned all those years ago. I turned back to my sketches, my old tree studies, reviewed it and lined over the existing art. And before painting, shaded it properly, planned out the scene, cut out the unnecessary bits that hindered the epicness of the painting. All this I did before I rendered. And after revisions, planning, and properly composing, I finally made the tree that I always wanted to make, and it was glorious. One thing to note though, is that if you zoom in, it's just scratchy brush strokes and suggestive details. There are no meticulously rendered bits, because I only focused on the big picture, which was the tree itself. Fast forward to the next year, I wanted to make an Imperial Knights splash art like the ones Igor Sid made, taking inspiration from that. And at that time, House Morton was my favorite knight house. The red, black, and gold color scheme got to me. And so, I sketched out the scene, more ambitious than my treehouse painting, more complicated than my other Imperial Knights painting. Where my epic tree landscape was merely a single front subject with a simple background, this time, I made a piece that was essentially a 3-layer composition, with a foreground, middle ground, and background, with many complex figures. Once the sketch was made, I began painting from the back to the front, as I always did with many of my landscapes. Now, the problem was, many of my landscapes, both original pieces and studies, had distant clouds and mountains which were logically simple and were intended as such. But for this Imperial Knight painting, a lot was going on. Titans were fighting in the background, other knights were fighting behind and in front of the subject. It was all so chaotic, detailed, and complicated. Hence, what resulted was this flat piece where the point of view was all warped. Because the titans in the back looked just as detailed as the knights at the front and middle, like they were in the same strip of thin land. The major flaws of this painting was its perception of depth that took out any sense of titanic size, the equal rendering to everything in sight, which just ruined any sort of scaling between the figures across the board. Plus, nothing to reference that these knights were actually big mech suits. In fact, the presence of the titans in the background just made them seem like small robots in comparison. Feeling defeated, I tried to take it off my mind by doing a watercolor painting of a titan, inspired by the old Adeptus Mechanicus art as well as the Hell's Reach Imperator Titan. After that, I went back and started from the bottom, and resketched the Imperial Knights epic painting. This time, I started it all in digital and just made a rough draft of the composition. Just a simple way of composing and layering the front, middle, and background. Now this time, I didn't start painting from the back, nor was I painting with color. I wanted to see this through step by step, and I asked myself, what is the focus of this painting? And of course, identified it as the menacing figure in the middle, stepping over a dead opponent, firing his machine gun into the distance, while standing heroically. And so, for a week, I only painted and rendered the middle ground subject of the painting with every possible detail imaginable. Nothing else, not the foreground, not the background, just the main subject for an entire week. Then I did the foreground, which was a little less detailed, and I used a larger brush to express them as the closer figures of the painting. Then I had this idea of separating the background and middle ground with a blaze of fire, then painting the background with the knights first, and lastly painting the titans, fighting all the way behind. And this time, it only took a few days because I didn't make them as detailed for a good reason. What resulted in this experiment was not just a contrast in light and size, but a contrast in detail, which made the titans look bigger and much further. And before I colored the piece, I added tiny space marines and Eldar fighting within the battlefield, intensifying the size of the knights themselves, while making the titans shrouded in the background be more ominously gigantic than how they initially looked like. Finally, I colored it, gave the knights their proper yellows, blacks, and reds, having the fire and machine gun light up the battlefield, giving the shots and eyes some glow, and after that, the epic painting was finished. only took me a week to start the next revision and not several years, so I believe that's progress. And so, I finally made something that puts me closer to one of my dream goals: making an epic painting. And what I learned from this experience was that there are many aspects to painting depending on what it is exactly you're painting. Like how I've learned that the things I got good at in making portraits and characters were not always particularly effective in making wide open landscapes and big paintings. Different paintings, it seems, require different methods, which comes with their own separate ways of composing, preparing, rendering, and whatnot. I hope this retelling of my experience can be of help to someone out there who might be in the middle of where I used to be, or perhaps you've experienced the same thing some time ago. Or perhaps you've experienced something entirely different. In any case, this was at best something to take a lesson in, or at least something to think about. Well then, that would be all. And if you're pursuing grand ambitions, no one should have the right to judge you for not having tried. Thank you for your time, and until then, see you.